and interpreters that were in the employ of Pharaoh. And that was their job. And they could have gone to those guys and say, what does this mean? And those guys would have consulted, and they would say, this is what this means, and interpreted their dream. But they didn't have access to anybody like that. So, and that's why they're so upset. So Joseph says, well, tell me. The chief cupbearer told his dream to Joseph and said to him, in my dream, behold, there was a vine in front of me, just like on the tomb painting. There was a vine in front of me, and on the vine were 3 branches, and it was budding. Its blossoms came out, and its clusters produced ripe grapes. Now Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes and squeezed them into Pharaoh's cup, and I put the cup into Pharaoh's hand. And Joseph said to him, this is the interpretation of it. The 3 branches are 3 days. Within 3 days, more days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your office. And you will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand, according to your former custom, as when you were his cupbearer. Only keep me in mind when it goes well with you, and please do me a kindness by mentioning me to Pharaoh, and get me out of this house. He calls it a house. It's called a pit in the next chapter. But he calls it a house. Get me out of this house. For I was in fact kidnapped from the land of the Hebrews, and even here I have done nothing that they should put me in the dungeon. I'm innocent, forensically and existentially innocent, and besides, I was not born a slave. I was not born an enslaved person. I was kidnapped. I was taken. I was shanghaied and brought here. When the chief baker saw that he had interpreted favorably, he said to Joseph, I also saw in my dream, and behold, there were 3 baskets of white bread on my head. That's something to think about. That'd be a lot to try to balance up there. And in the top basket, there were all sorts of baked food for Pharaoh, and the birds were eating them out of the basket on my head. Then Joseph answered and said, this is its interpretation. The 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 more days, Pharaoh will lift up your head. So far, so good. It's the same thing he said to the other guy, right? Lift up your head from you, and will hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat the flesh off you. Okay. Let's stop there for just a second. Let's talk about who these guys are. Chief cupbearer. That's an important position and would continue to be. We know another chief cupbearer to Artaxerxes I. Remember who he was? He's got a book in the Bible, by the way. Nehemiah. That's right. It's a very highly placed official. In Pharaoh's court, the chief cupbearer was basically the guy who was in charge of serving Pharaoh's meals, serving them. Not just serving them, tasting them, making sure that they were safe, making sure, overseeing even their preparation, not as to the preparation, but to make sure it was all healthy, wholesome. In other words, he's more than just a waiter or a sommelier. He's a guy who is part of the security staff, and because they were so intimately, they had such intimate access to Pharaoh and were there all the time, and even beyond the Egyptian court, but in the other courts of ancient times, they were highly valuable and trusted counselors most of the time too. I mean, they were just guys that were there when you were eating, and they were highly born. I mean, it's not like, and so it's a very important person. There's a really cool detail. He says, I put it in the palm of his hand. The Egyptians had not developed the technology of handles. None of their cups had handles on them. So he would have put it right in the palm of his hand, And he talks about squeezing the grapes. It's important, not that I want to make a big deal out of this in any New Testament passage, but it's important for us to realize that anything that is grape juice is called wine in the Bible. It's just grape juice. And one can imagine that he would do this himself, squeeze the grapes himself, so that he knew it was good. And so that's who he is. The chief baker would primarily have made bread, but he would have been basically the head chef, the guy who was in charge of preparing the food. So they'd be working closely together. Now, for some reason, Pharaoh is furious with these two guys, and I don't know why, and we're not told why, but one could imagine a variety of things. Maybe something tasted funny and he thought he'd been poisoned. Maybe he got food poisoned and got sick and thought he had been poisoned. Maybe he heard gossip and these guys were implicated falsely. Or maybe one of them really was guilty because one of them gets executed and the other one doesn't. But they are implicated in the same event. And Pharaoh's furious with them both, and they both go to jail. But they're not executed immediately. And the reason is that there would have been an investigation. And then they would have, then what the next thing would happen to them. So that's what they're waiting on. And it took a while for Pharaoh to come down with a decision. So they both had these dreams, and they're so similar. And but before we talk about them individually, we've got bread, and we've got juice, and we've got a meal. A lot of commentators, even from the early years of Christianity, see another connection between this and the story of Jesus, or at least the Last Supper, or that. Yes, I see that. To me, that's a little bit of a stretch, but it's there. I mean, it is there, and I'm not going to say it's not there because it is there. But I wouldn't build a sermon on that, or even a table talk. But anyway, but there it is. So then the chief baker is so encouraged by this. And before we go to the chief baker, notice that Joseph is completely dependent upon God, and yet he does his best. And when he has the opportunity to argue his case or to take advantage of that opportunity, he seizes it. He says, "This is going to happen to you when you go back to Pharaoh's presence. Don't forget me. Don't forget me. Remember me." And he didn't say, "Remember me and give me a job." He says, "Remember me because I don't belong here." You know, I think Joseph wants to be sent back home. That's what I'm thinking at this point. Joseph wants to be sent back home. I don't belong here. I was snatched from my home and sold into slavery here, and I didn't do anything when I got here except my best for my master. And who can do anything about this? I mean, who's more highly placed than Potiphar? Not many, but Pharaoh is. And this guy's got Pharaoh's ear every meal. So don't forget me. And of course, he does remember Joseph 2 years later, but at the exact right time, the time that God needs him to remember him. Okay, so the chief baker, he saw all different kinds of bread in these 3 baskets. It's like, I just picture him like Carmen Miranda with big things on her head, like that. Like 3 feet high, 3 or 4 feet high on his head. 3 baskets of bread. I found a reference to an interesting document. Let me find it here where I've written down it because I don't remember a document also from the 14th century BC, from the 1300s from Egypt. And it listed 38 different varieties of pastries and 57 different varieties of bread that was served in Pharaoh's household. So when he says all kinds, they mean all kinds, So, and they didn't have chocolate, They didn't have chocolate. Cocoa beans are a New World crop, so they didn't have chocolate until the 1500s in Egypt. So anyway, 1500s AD, not the 1700s BC. It's going to be 3,000 years before anybody in Egypt knows anything about chocolate. But they had all these different kinds of pastries, sweet pastries, and all these different kinds of bread. That blows my mind. 38 varieties of pastries and 57 varieties of bread that Pharaoh, and grain was the staple. I mean, they ate meat and they ate vegetables, but grain was the staple. food for everybody, and the finer grains for the finer families. But everybody liked their bread and their carbs, don't we all? And anyway, all kinds of bread in the baskets, and the birds are eating them. And then Joseph, it's hard, it's not funny, but I kind of laugh at it because he says word for word, that means 3 days, and he's going to lift up your head. Okay, he said the very same words, but lift up your head means lift up your head and bring you back to where you belong. But now lift up your head means decapitate you. He's going to decapitate you, and he's going to hang you. He's going to decapitate you and hang you. Hang you on a tree. That is not a noose. Okay? Gallows, as we know them, were invented in Great Britain in 1813. And hanging with a noose is only as old as the 4th century A.D. The Germanic tribes shared it with the Romans and then took it to the British Isles. So there you go. 400. So in other words, it's 2,000 years before anybody has a noose around their neck. When you read about hanging in the Old Testament, like Haman was hanged, you got pierced on a pike. And maybe they stuck a pike through you and hang you out like they were hanging you on a meat hook and let you die that way. Or they chopped off your head or killed you in some other way and stuck you on a pike and let the animals and the birds eat your corpse, which is exactly what is described in the text. So that's what's going to happen to him. And it says in verse 20, it came about on the third day, the third day. There's also a connection to them. On the third day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, that he made a feast for all of his servants, and he lifted up the head of the chief cupbearer and the head of the chief baker among his servants. And he restored the chief cupbearer to his office, and he put the cup into Pharaoh's hand. But he hanged the chief baker, just as Joseph had interpreted to them. Yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. Okay, before we get to some lessons, and I turn this over to you, just some things I want to mention. Two that I probably should have mentioned at the beginning of the class. But this one right now, the word remember, it's going to be key in the next chapter. Remember means more than just, that's right, I'd forgotten that. It means more than that. Like know means, that's right, I've memorized that. Know means more than that. And that's important in the Joseph story. Remember what it said about Noah in the ark after the rain stopped and it was time for things to come to an end. It said, and God did what? Remember Noah. That doesn't mean God goes, Noah's still out there. No, it means that God, cared for him. God cared for him. And so there's a deeper meaning than just, it does mean that for this guy, but it means more than that. Because Joseph is asking more than that, don't forget my story. He's asking this guy to do him a solid. He's asking this guy to advocate for him. And he didn't do it. Not yet, but he will. And later on, at the beginning of the book of Exodus, that a Pharaoh arose who did not know Joseph. It doesn't mean he didn't know who Joseph was. Maybe he didn't. It means that the connection that Pharaoh had with Joseph and his legacy and his people was severed. Didn't respect it. So there are deeper meanings to these words. Which Pharaoh is this? Well, it depends on when you date. There are a couple of things that happen during the time, in and around the time that Joseph goes to Egypt, between that time and the time that the Exodus takes place. Some people date the Exodus from the 1200s, some from the 13 to early 1400s, late 1400s, because this is BC. But it all depends on where you date a couple of things. One is Pharaoh Akhenaten. Pharaoh Akhenaten is important. He reigned in the 1300s BC. And Pharaoh Akhenaten decreed that Egypt would be monotheistic. He rejected the pantheon and worshiped one God. This is contemporary with the Jews being there somehow. Might be the early part, might be the late part, but it was contemporary with them being there. And it's hard not to imagine that a highly placed person like Joseph, who talks to Potiphar about Yahweh so that Potiphar knows his name, and who talks to Pharaoh about God, singular, not gods, plural. And I'm not arguing because I don't think that Akhenaten is this Pharaoh. I think Joseph is much earlier. But it's hard to imagine that there wasn't some connection between that notion and the presence of the Jews, and particularly highly placed Jews, in Egypt. The other thing are the Hyksos. And the Hyksos are a people in possession of chariots, people who invaded and controlled Egypt for a period of time in and around all this going on. So the question is it the Hyksos who enslave the Jews, or do they come later? I don't know. So you know, people, those questions are being asked, and you can't really pick up a commentary without reading something about the Hyksos and Akhenaten. The thing is, it factors in somehow, and I kind of think that the Hyksos are the ones who enslaved the Hebrews, but I can't prove that. And if you had better information, I would say I yield, because it's almost impossible to know. But it's in this period of time, sometime around 1800 BC to around 12 to 1300 BC. This is the time of period that we're talking about between Joseph and the Exodus. And all the things that I've mentioned have come, all the information that I've mentioned to give background have come from that period of time. Okay, let's talk about what we learn here. Joseph, oh man, all the things we learned about Joseph. Joseph is a guy who's being dependent upon. We learn that, and we see him in action. We don't see him managing the fields of Potiphar, but we do see the kind of a jailer he was. We see it here. And we see a man who's not only doing his job and doing it responsibly and well, but a man who has had so many bad things happen to him, and he does not take that out on other people. I mean, I cannot tell you how moved I am by that verse where he says, "You guys look down. What's wrong with you today?" It's like that one little verse in the book of Ruth where Boaz goes out to the fields and he says, to his workers, "Yahweh bless you." And they say, "Yahweh bless you too." I mean, this is happening during the days of the Judges. If you just read Judges before you read Ruth, and the first line is, during the days of the Judges, you think, oh man, this is like New York City in the 70s, but worse, I mean, it's like, the worst neighborhood you can think of on a worst day, that you could think about. But no, these are people being nice to each other, and he's in jail, and he's been falsely accused and sold into slavery. And he's nice to these guys. I mean, genuinely nice to these guys and helpful to these guys. So there's that. There's confidence in Joseph. And I don't mean that in a way that means arrogance at all. An arrogant man would not be this kind to these other guys. An arrogant man would have a chip on his shoulder. But there is confidence based upon his relationship with God and God's concern for him, because he has not doubted that, not at all. He says, interpretations belong to God, right? But then he said, so tell me about this. And he's confident that, and he has the same confidence next week in front of Pharaoh. It says the same words. Interpretations belong to God. So tell me it's giving all deference to God and all credit to God, and yet there's this confidence that I'm right with God, God is my God, and I can do this thing for this man because God has gifted me to do that. There's the honesty of it. I mean, he just tells them straight up. That's his responsibility. This is the word of the Lord, and he just tells them what the word of the Lord is, what it means, as he does with Pharaoh. He just tells them straight up what's going to happen to them. I think if we have one vignette, this doesn't happen in the heat of any moment. This happens on a normal day. You can call any day in jail a normal day, on a normal day for Joseph in jail. I mean, this is him going about his day. And then this thing happening. And we get to see Joseph. What a good man. I mean, I don't know that so many qualities of Joseph are on display anywhere else as they are on display here. What a good man. Okay, your thoughts? Wow. Yes.
We know Joseph has already had dreams that everybody read meaning into.
Yeah.
But none of those have come to fruition yet. Like, this confidence that he displays is based on what he trusts God will do. If this was like after things had happened and see it played out, what God said to me happened. No, he doesn't have that yet. And yet he just continues to just do the next right thing and trust that God is working on it out. And the guy didn't give the bad report to, could have turned around and killed him. He just keeps finding one. And I just find that so admirable.
I know, you're exactly right. I mean, he has his confidence is in the dream. He had the dreams first, and he knows what they mean, and he has confidence that they're true. The cool thing to me, Melinda, is that there's nothing in the dream that would lead you to believe he was going to be ruler over all Egypt. And I'm sure he has no idea yet that he's going to be ruler over all Egypt. But when the moment comes next week, man, he's ready with a plan. We talk about everybody in this family's got a plan. It's not that gene skipped him. He just uses that strategic ability properly and in the right way, and he's ready with a plan. In the same way, he's ready to call in a favor on this that pays off later on. I mean, he's ready with that. I mean, his intelligence, which I didn't mention as much as anything, that shines through everywhere. I mean, he's a really smart guy, and he's a responsible guy, and they all say that about him, and everybody experiences that. Jacob experienced it. Potiphar experienced it. Pharaoh is going to experience it, and certainly God overall experienced all those things about Joseph. It's just a blessing to get to spend time with him. And I think of all the stories about Joseph, there are stories that move you more and move you to tears. But this one is such a sweet, except for the guy getting decapitated and stuck on a pike for the birds to eat. I mean, it's just a wonderful time to spend with Joseph. Okay, anyone else? Yes.
Yeah, Joseph is an example of a guy who so much stuff happened to him, and yet he still, he still is always acting as God would have him, no matter what's going on, and he doesn't know the future. He doesn't know what God's got to him. And, he was doing his job, and he didn't fall for Potiphar's wife. Yeah. And yet, he gets punished for that. Yeah. Despite that.
Yeah. He knows what we know. And even though he can interpret dreams and has had dreams, He only knows what we know, and that is God keeps his promises, and he knows what God's promise to him is. I mean, that's what he knows. He doesn't know how, and he certainly has experienced in his life. That doesn't mean bad things are not going to happen. And yet, always maintains his integrity. Yes, Sam?
I guess the other amazing thing about Joseph, we know he has dreams. That he doesn't really say them from God, but obviously he believes it's from God. And nothing else. He doesn't have his word or any of his past promises to fall back on. Or the thing we sometimes would like to see, written across the sky, or handwriting on the wall, or other things. It's amazing that he can hold on to his faith. And I say all those things, but I'm sure his dad probably put things in him that his guide keep him.
Oh, I agree. And that's an important thing to point out. And I said this in my prayer, and I should have mentioned it in Bible class. I'm glad you mentioned it, Sam. He wasn't carrying around one of these. He didn't grow up with one of these. Honestly, the alphabet hasn't been invented yet. Okay? It hasn't. The Phoenicians are going to invent it in a couple of centuries. But in the 1700s BC, all they have are hieroglyphics. I mean, that's what they have, Sumerian, writing on clay tablets and Egyptian pictures. They don't have an alphabet yet. And honestly, it's only been in the last 150, 200 years that every household could have a Bible, that people could afford it and you could mass produce it. And it's only been in the last 50 to 100 years that we've been able to really carry them around the way we do. We are spoiled in that way, and we don't appreciate the gift that we have. We just don't. But what he had was the promises of God, and I do think that's one of the things we noticed in the Judas story. There were no Ten Commandments. There was no law of Moses. So how would Judah have known about his levirate obligations to Tamar had God not communicated them to this family and he not been taught those things? So I do think clearly, there are so many examples in the book of Genesis that in the patriarchal age there was a handing down of the faith. That's why Isaac and Jacob end up in Hebrews chapter 11, and for no other reason, because there's really nothing else for them to be in there for. They're there because they handed down the faith to the next generation. And we see that, not just in Joseph, but in Judah too. I mean, they have knowledge of what God requires of them. But what they didn't have was this, or the detail of God's plan. They had almost no detail of God's plan. Certainly not as much as we do. Not as much as even David did. But they still, believed in God's promises. Yeah. That's an excellent point, Sam. Thank you. Yes, Margaret.
Is this occurring before the time? We know that the fathers were held responsible for teaching. Is this before the time of the synagogue? Is this before the time when the boys would go through I forget what to call it now.
That's a good question. We'll talk more about that next week. In Mosaic law, okay, no, that's not true. Let me rephrase that. In Mosaic law, you had to be 21, I think. Is that right, to serve in the military? If you got married, you got a year off. You have to really work or serve in the military for the first year, So by the time Jesus was born, you weren't a full adult male until you were 30, full member of the covenant. But then again, 13, even before Jesus was born, was thought of as a significant time. And of course, 13 is when a boy is bar mitzvahed in modern times. And then that means they're made part of the covenant. They're full member of the covenant, son of the covenant. That's what bar mitzvah means. But then, of course, they were circumcised on the 8th day. So there are, various ways to measure. So I'm not sure when a man was considered a man in the Jewish community, the Hebrew community at this time. It's a long time before the synagogue. Synagogues grew up sometime almost certainly during the Babylonian captivity. I'm going to be writing a bulletin article about this later, so I researched it just recently, which I knew the earliest specific reference to a synagogue is actually from the island of Delos, which is a Greek island, from the 4th century BC. But there are clearly, I'm talking about visual evidence, written evidence, but there have been synagogues themselves, clearly structures used as synagogues that are that old or even older. So there's not going to be a synagogue for another 1,000 years.
The Lord's house that they went to, or a certain?
No.
Okay.
No.
Certain.
Comes with the giving of the law with Moses on Mount Sinai.
Area that they needed to worship.
Well, you have Abraham wherever he moves, and Isaac and Jacob establishing an altar, and they worship there, or they'll come back like Jacob came back to Bethel, where God had appeared to him, but that's what they do in the book of Genesis. They build an altar. Okay, anyone else? Yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to say that with all the things that Joseph was awarded to in Potiphar's house, he had everything except his wife. And then in prison, he was in charge of all the prisoners. He never lost his being humble and being sensitive to the people around him. He's sensitive about, I can't touch you because, my master withheld everything but you. And then the baker and the cupbearer, he was sensitive to when they were dejected, when he was supposed to be in charge of it. So he never lost that humility that he had. Yeah. Sensitive about other people.
Yeah. Thank you. Yes, that's enormous. We always see that with Joseph, his sensitivity to other people. And let's not forget that when he's, producing this charade, trying to find out what Benjamin, is Benjamin alive? And, do you have another brother? And, I fully believe that he's not yanking their chain. I think the safety of his own brother Benjamin is what's the deepest in his heart. And I think until he knows Benjamin and can lay eyes on Benjamin and knows that Benjamin is safe, because he knows what happened to him, I think that he's so yes, Bob, that's enormous. In every one of these stories, he's demonstrating his sensitivity, his emotional intelligence, but beyond that, his sensitivity to other people, because it's not fear necessarily that prompts his refusal of Potiphar's wife. It's his sense of responsibility, his sensitivity to his relationship with Potiphar and with God. And the way he says no in such a way that he doesn't say no in any way that could be construed as insulting to her. And, and there's never a better example than what we just read in verse 7, You guys look down, what's wrong? And, just the level of emotional intelligence that he has, but then the sensitivity and the caring that he has for other people. That's there too. Okay. Anyone else? Well, thank you for Bible class tonight. He's going to get a new job next week. He's going to get a bath and a shave and some new clothes, and he's going to get to meet Pharaoh and get a new job. So that's next time. We're going to do the first part of chapter 41 next week. So read through verse 36 for next week, and that's as far as we're going to go next week. Thank you for your attention.